talked a little bit about this off camera. What are some of the weaker, small, mid, and long form works in your corpus, and do you think that they can be improved? We've talked about some of your lesser great poems
Yeah.
and how rewriting them would be worsened, but how about some essays? I know there's a couple that you've talked to me about, and others that.
Well, what first came to mind was my books. There's a book that I did, one of my earliest novels I did about 10 years ago called The Trial of Horatio Guzman. And I wrote this book after I had seen a documentary called In Search of, it was, I forget the name of the documentary. It was about this man who was accused, he and his son were accused of abusing kids sexually. So in the book, this character, Horatio Guzman, is accused of sexually abusing someone. And as he's arrested and brought on trial, he's reading within the book a sci-fi book that's dealing with the consequences of human and cyborg and robot sexuality. In the book, it's set in the book within the book. It's set during, say, the 2070s or 2080s, after gay marriage is no longer a big thing in America, and now people are saying it's that human beings can't be allowed to marry non-sentient beings who are not human. That so it was a stand-in when I wrote it for gay marriage. How quickly things have changed, and so this guy is coming to terms with his homosexuality and his abusive nature. But we don't really know if he is the abuser. I leave that uh, up in the air. But anyway, so that's a book that if I were to do that now, I'd probably make it deeper and richer. But it's a very good book. There's no book that I've written since '04 that is in any way, shape, or form a bad book. Even the worst short stories are just good, solid short stories. Out of the 250 or so, 300 short stories that I that I have
wrote
that I've written, there's none that's a bad short story. The worst of them is good, solid. But that came to mind. What essays are you thinking of?
Well, the one that you mentioned to me, and I won't get into all of them, but it was the Monica Wood essay.
Oh yeah.
You promoted that one book of hers, which is a good book. I've read it myself. But even when I read your essay, I disagreed with some of the points that you raised in there, simply because some of her stories are never really in depth.
They're very good in a one-dimensional way. There isn't the side currents. There isn't the depth there. But I remember when I was just starting. I think I did that in '04 or '05, maybe that essay. It might have even been before I started writing short stories. It might have even been before I started writing true life. And so I was looking at the absolute dearth of good short story writings there, and that's probably one of the few times where I overdid it, because I think I had read 3 or 4 short story books. I can't even remember the names of them. One was a woman. I remember there was another guy, Unrest in Civil War Land or something. That might have been a few years afterwards. But I read and reviewed 4 or 5 really horrid short story books. And so this one, which was a good to very good short story manuscript, I mean, that's just a fuck up. I mean, and I think I've adjusted and toned down some of the language in ensuing years, but I've left it up pretty much untouched. But so yeah, anyone can err, and that's an erring there. But again, it was probably just my frustration at the time.
I'm going to preface this with this statement: a lesser work from Kurosawa, for instance, Kagemusha, second-rate Kurosawa, is still better than anything most filmmakers have ever made or even conceived of. Now, 21 Conversations and Monarchs of New York are probably fourth-rate Dan Schneider, but they're still excellent books by themselves, and they're different than a lot of the other short story books that I've read, even by supposed masters like Raymond Carver, who never really had a cohesive book, but had great high points in between. The best of Raymond Carver is probably better than many of the short stories, even some of the best of them in 21 Conversations and Monarchs of New York, but they're never as cohesive as the whole of the books. Talk a little bit about those two, because I think they're very good to add. Hello? Excellent. Well, it's been the last short story in Hello?
Yeah, I lost you there for a second.
Even in the best of Monarchs of New York, say the final novella that leads to it, it has exposition in it. You mentioned to me before that once I read some of your later stuff, it will seem weaker, and it does. It still is arguably a great tale, but I just want you to talk about those two works as well, since we're on this tangent here.
I think you could make an argument that the 4 or 5 best Raymond Carver stories are better than the best 21 Conversations. And I have another book called 21 More Conversations where I switch them around, the viewpoints and retell those stories. But that's probably a consequence because the most of the 21 Conversations are anywhere from 2,500 to about 4,000 words. So they're relatively short stories. Whereas I think the 4 or 5 best Carver short stories range from 8 to 10, 12,000 words. So they're anywhere from 2 to 3 or 4 times as long. So I would say that. I would say if you were to look, though, even there on a paragraph by paragraph basis, I don't have some of the fat that even in his best short stories that I think Carver does. And also in just those 21 stories and 21 Conversations, I have a much broader range of spectrum of the human condition than Carver has in everything he ever wrote. Carver is sort of like Hermann Hesse, and he's sort of like Kafka in that he has a very narrow range, sort of artistic losers who drink a lot. And you can only get those 4 or 5 great flowerings from such a limited palette.
Seems like all the great short story writers were like that. Even Chekhov and Reynolds Price, they seem to have a type or style that they have. And Chekhov has hundreds of short stories, and if you read all of them, they kind of mirror into each other eventually.
Yeah. Monarchs of New York is one of those books that's, it's not a gimmick book, but the idea was to have realistic short stories lead into a sort of realistic sci-fi-y, slightly future middle stories that are a bit longer, and then to a science fiction novella. And it's sort of a doomsday thing, and it's interesting. It was an experiment, but I knew that that would it would be what it would be. I did that with some other later books. I have a book I think I've mentioned before called Helaina, Quinn, Malley, based upon a woman I worked with at the supermarket who died at the age of 31 or 32 from some brain hemorrhage. And I do a similar thing where she appears in only 2 or 3 small scenes in the book. Most of it's people remembering who she was. So it's a portrait of a character that we don't really see. It's sort of like Rebecca, the book Rebecca, but it's done even more so and in a different way, a more daring way than du Maurier's Rebecca is. But again, that's a book that's a very good book. You could even argue excellent, and it's got great moments. But it's those kinds of books that you have to write. It's those kinds of works of art that you have to do on the way to becoming great in something. Even though I was a great poet, I wasn't yet a great novelist or a great fictionist. But there are a lot of, I'd say, out of the 21 stories from 21 Conversations, I'd say there are probably 8, 10, maybe 12 great short stories. Then the rest of them range from near great to very good. They all have a moment. People have some conversation, but even there, those conversations are more the way most people do conversations. It isn't the total immersion that I later developed.
Yeah, reading them after reading True Life, you realize that how essential the poetry playing off the prose was, because the prose, while it is already excellent, is not as great as some of the standalone pieces that I read later.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the next short story collection, Newtown. This one I think is more along the lines of a great short story collection and also a novel of place, as you mentioned. It has the undercurrent of the Newtown Creek. Is it not the introduction of Polly too, or was that in an earlier short story manuscript?
Which story is the
Because there
Polymeric?
was one on a bus where a boy
Yeah,
is going on and he
yeah, I
meets
think that was
Polly.
the first Polymeric Valley story. No, I take that back. The first Polymeric Valley story, I think, was. Let me see.
Was with Joey, right, when he's poisoned.
Yeah, that which book is that in?
I think it must be in 21
Okay,
Conversations,
so
but I think
that's
that
the
the one
first
on the bus
appearance of
was quite
Polymeric Valley when
poison.
he poisons his lover's son or something. Um, that's the first appearance of Paulie. Then I deepen Paulie here, and then I reuse and I reuse I reuse that short story or that incident from that short story later on in A Norwegian in the Family too. Um, so yeah, and the Polymeric Valley here is more dark, brooding, remote. We don't really get a sense of his personality because he's being looked up to by other people that recognize him as a legendary kind of figure, and the boy has no clue about him. Now, of course, his backstory that I give in later works, especially A Norwegian in the Family, didn't exist then. So, uh, but having that back filled in, it still works in that sense. And the Newtown is probably about midway between the total immersion and the first two or three books that I did. In that, I think Newtown is book number 11, 12, or 13. So I'd written about a dozen books before that, 10 or 12 books before that, and it was my trying to get bigger, longer. Each of those short stories range from, I think, the shortest is about 7,500, 8,000 words, to I think I have the last story, which is sort of my version of The Dead by Joyce. That story, I think, goes about 16, 18, 20,000 words. So it was me pulling the dough out and playing with narrative and character and whatnot. I hadn't gotten the conversations are very good. Some of them are even great in a lesser way than the total immersive conversations. But that one does stick out. One of my favorite stories, the Mayor of Maspeth story there about the old black bum. That's where
Oh yeah.
that was the first appearance of the Crooms family because I believe I did Newtown before I did not True Life, Tumbleweeds, and so that's where I think that's where I first introduced the Crooms family, the Link kid.
As a point of trivia, and we'll talk about Tumbleweeds a little bit in Toto later. Did you have grand designs for Polly from the beginning, or is that something that evolved naturally?
It evolved.
Oh,
Bit Run Rheingold was a one-off character that I did had him in a few short stories. He appeared because I had my initial the first dwarves that you encounter if you read my books chronologically, Elsie and Danny Little. Danny Little appears in The Legend of Dario Sandoval, which is a story there where we first encounter well, Dario Sandoval we don't encounter, we first hear him because we'll never see Dario Sandoval. He's one of those characters that will be talked about, but we'll never see him in the flesh. And there's a scene where the guys telling the story are talking about Danny Little, the dwarf, being carried like in a suitcase or something, and that was a Dario Sandoval legendary tale. And then we later in Ugly Girls, I think it is, meet his sister Elsie Little, who's a dwarf that at some point, and it's I guess in the 70s or 80s, Bit von Rheingold dated and then left because she was a dwarf. I guess she might have been the only dwarf he ever dated. Who knows? Maybe he was in a deeper period between his porno stuff and then Bit came on. I did the bit of Golem, and then I expanded Bit out in this book, Norwegian.
yeah. Bit of Golem was an interesting read. The dialogue is, I think, never better at that point.
Mm.
But the one thing that I notice is that it's kind of filmic in this way, in that some of the most effective moments are silent. It's just him reflecting and kind of just getting into his being that way.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that assessment in that in that
Yeah.
manner, and how do you get to those moments so naturally? Because it will have long spans of dialogue, and then kind of almost like a Relka poem, kind of have a twist on it where he's just reflecting.
It's the consequence of the form. I mean, it's a novel. It's not a play. I wouldn't have to have those moments in a play, or they. Those are things that you could say. Bit stares out at the audience, and then it's up to the actor to convey that. You don't have that luxury in a novel, so you have to fill in the blanks there.
Yeah, this human animal plays off the title by Jacob Bronowski, the human animal, correct? And
No. I got the title from This Sporting Life, the film that I mentioned.
oh,
So This Sporting Life, and I thought, okay, human beings, this because that all those stories are about human beings coming to deal with things that humans don't like to deal. So looking at humans from a more scientific perspective, that's why I got it. So it came from This Sporting Life, the Lindsay Anderson film, not Bronowski.
this is the first instance of total immersion, as you've noted. I think I'm not sure if that tale is the best tale in the whole manuscript. There's, I think, some better ones.
Which one? The TVG 9000?
Yes, I
Well,
think that's one. That's a
you
great
can
tale,
argue
but I
that there
think
are lots of great stories in there, but that's by far the most important story
yeah.
in terms of developmentally.
I've noticed though that reading Norwegian, reading Vincetti, the conversations, as you've said before, they'll be talking about something and not even realize they're talking about something deeper, whereas these ones aren't as seamless in that way. Maybe TPG 9000 is, but some of the other short stories still have dialogue in which it's much more consciously poetic, whereas, as you've noted before, it's de-poeticized in the later novels.
Yeah, I mean, there are some times that can work. I'm not against. I'm not saying that every conversation that I ever write in any work henceforth is going to uh, be in the more immersive technique, but there will probably be a bit more conscious poeticisms in the Gorgeous George book when the wife is just describing things from her point of view, whereas Gorgeous George will be more immersive in his conversations, so that there'll be a
Yes,
tension between the two.
it's not even strictly such in the later novels, simply because framing the scene, you often use poetic devices and ways of framing them than than just simply strictly going to total immersion.
Yeah.
So it takes you out of it and then it puts you right back in. It's in service to both parts. Let's talk about a kid's book. This is a near great novel as far as I'm concerned. You could certainly argue it's a great novel. You mentioned a good analogy where it was kind of Tom Sawyer to Huckleberry Finn of your other works. I find it has the whole dream trope is a little expected, but it is metaphysical and it is a different kind of kids books than I've ever read. Even though it takes the form of Pinocchio, it has a completely different way of using it, and it does get into the character of not just the individual cats, but also the metaphysical sides with Henry Matsumi and his friend. What is his name? Colby something.
Yeah, Kabi Caputo.
Kabi Kabodu. Yeah. All right. So talk a
Well,
little bit about a kid's book, and
the
I know it was
the
written for a
reason that
12.
I had to do the dream thing was because, despite some of the wacky stuff, the Schneider fictive universe, there's no magic. There's no there's no stuff. When I did, for example, Horatio Guzman in the sci-fi, that's a book that he's reading, and Monarchs of New York is set in the future where it's sci-fi, so it's speculative in that way. So I don't have wizards and warlocks and whatnot. This isn't whatchamacall. This isn't uh, Game of Thrones or The Hobbit. This is there's no magic that happens. So I had to explain why even in this children's book, cats can speak, and the only way to do that is by making this be a book that's written within that thing by Henry Matsumi, and Henry Matsumi too is going to do that. And even though it goes there because it's a children's book. I can get away with that because you don't you there has to be a certain sort of, like in old films, the way they open up a children's book. And now I'm going to tell you a story. I wasn't going to do Once Upon a Time to open the book, but I wanted to have something familiar. But in the end, we get that sort of lifting off of the the passing of time, the deaths of the cats, and how much they mean to the characters, and we get at the end we we get an explanation for why the that Oscar was dreaming. And a cat can't ratiocinate, and so most of this is Henry Matsumi's ideas of Oscar the cat dreaming. And so a cat, you can't I couldn't have the same kind of depth that I have, say, between the spy and the philosopher that I have in this spy book that I'm doing. uh, and so you have to rely on some of those things, and tweak them and twist them in some ways uh, within the formats of the genre, so that it can be a genre book but also transcend it. Because if I did have Oscar the cat ratiocinating the way and as deeply as intelligent human beings are, there would be an equally big and probably even much bigger problem of the lack of realism, because it's a children's book. And so you have to I would not have done anything like that. There will be no people waking up from a dream in any short stories unless I come up with some valid reason for it, uh, or ending books like that in any other thing. But because it's a children's book, that gives you sort of the license to try to play around with and rehabilitate something. And I think it does do that because there is a genuine emotion that's evoked by having gone through Oscar's travails with him. And realistically, too, if you compare, even if you account for the characters being able to speak, non-human speaking, Oscar's adventures are pretty workaday. He crosses a highway. He sees clothes and towels fluttering in the wind on washcloths. He thinks that he's not loved by his masters. It's not like he's encountering children turning into donkeys in Pinocchio. It's not like. So Oscar has the Oscar of the book, who is based on my lovable chubby guy Oscar in my real life. Oscar does go through what a cat might go through in a whole day. And we find out at the end that he actually never crosses the highway. So there's symbolism there too, because it's the big highway. It's called the big highway. So this is some barrier. And you could say that the highway symbolizes the infinite. Maybe Oscar goes to sleep because he can't cross over the big highway into some deeper sentience. So Oscar is, by the nature of the story, by the nature of his own actions, and by the nature of his own dreams, circumscribed as being a lesser cogitative being than a human being can be. Oscar can only think so much. Oscar can only feel so much. And in the end, Oscar is greatly satisfied to know that he is indeed loved, because he has this childlike quality despite everything. We find out that the cricket, I think it is a cricket or a grasshopper, whatever I have, too, just has these simple childlike desires to be acknowledged. Then I think when he meets a frog, is it, or a toad?
He meets several creatures along the way. Some are a little more deceptive to Oscar's putty mind.
Yeah, but so that's the reason you can't have in a children's book some Dostoevskian, angst and drama. You have to frame it in childlike ways. And waking up from a dream, the dream world is what the children do. But if you compare it to other things it's only a dream, whatever works, whether it's a movie or a book or a poem or something, I would put this in the top rank of it's just a dream endings.
You've made some good arguments for it. Do you think that children's books, though, by necessity, can't really reach the pantheon of great novels simply because of those lacks. The only things that I can think of are not really children's books or works or artworks like Incident or Huckleberry Finn. People have sometimes mislabeled Huckleberry Finn a kid's book or whatnot, but it is not a kid's book. It is an adult-minded book. That one can work and be put up there in the pantheon of great novel.
Children's
but
work.
Something like Charlotte's Web or something can never attain that, even if it's wrought better than it already is.
Yeah, Charlotte's Web, The Cricket in Times Square was a story I remember as 5, 6 years old reading. Have you read that, The Cricket in Times Square?
Yes, I enjoyed it highly in my youth.
Yeah, and so books like that, they are great genre works. This is why with films too, I talk about genre greats versus greats. I think my kid's book is great. I think you can make it just hurdle over, like Pinocchio, just hurdle over the bare minimum for great literature overall. Just as Tom Sawyer, though, cannot be as great as Huckleberry Finn, so Pinocchio or my kid's book can't be as great as Tumbleweeds even. But and putting aside even the differences in length, even if we were to discount that. But that's the problem with all genres. Books that are science fiction can't be as great literature unless they do something to move it over. The Foundation books, the Foundation trilogy by Asimov, by using the conceit of having this be a future history and writing it as if he was Edward Gibbon writing about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, that gives Asimov that little push that I think gets it out just enough out of genre. But the Foundation trilogy is not as great a work as name a great novel as A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. It can't be. This spy book that I'm doing has a spy, and he does some spy things, but it's not about being a spy. It's a spy book only in that its lead character has that as his profession. Just as A Norwegian in the Family is not a crime book, even though I initially said, well, I'm going to write a great crime novel. But it's a crime novel because the characters are criminals, not because it follows the genre conventions of a crime novel. Tumbleweeds is a crime novel, but it's really more a Bildungsroman, or I guess it's not really a Bildungsroman, even since all the Vincettis end up fucking their lives up and dying practically. So you have to move those things. The sci-fi book that I'm going to do, these historical novels on Genghis Khan, will not be sci-fi primarily. They will have sci-fi premises and whatnot, and there will be some tropes that I'll use and reuse from science fiction, such as going to another planet, meeting aliens, dealing with stuff. But it has to be more than just that. It has to be, because genre, by its definition, is a limited form. Any genre. And so in order to get into real great art that is qualitatively and just fundamentally beyond genre, you have to get beyond it. So